Have you ever had a friend who just won't shut up about a show or a movie? You know the one. They say things like, "Oh, you like The Matrix? Well, Dark City is such a superior film." Or, you really don't know TV unless you see The Wire. Most of the time they were right, but they are so obnoxious about it that it makes you want to not watch anything that they're talking about. This happened to me with Babylon 5. Because of such a person, I avoided this show for 30 years. Over the years, I kept thinking, maybe I should check this show out. But it was intimidating. This series is on a whole other level. There are websites devoted to what the best order is to watch it. I've been wanting to dive in and cover Babylon 5 for a while now. So why don't we just do a cannonball and watch one of the most important science fiction series of the 90s, and determine whether or not it was a game changer in the science fiction genre, in this episode of Gone, But Not Forgotten.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
Babylon 5 was created by the incredibly talented J.M. Straczynski. I have talked about JMS in my previous Gone But Not Forgotten episode on Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future. Straczynski has a rabid fan base, and with good reason. It's not just Babylon 5, he's also written for classic cartoons like The Real Ghostbusters, and even co-created She-Ra. He was also responsible for some iconic comic book series such as Rising Stars and my personal favorite, Midnight Nation. Side note, if you have not read Midnight Nation, I cannot tell you how much you should. Hopefully they'll adapt it into a show or movie one day. The origin of Babylon 5 is very unique, as it started out as a thought experiment. JMS had been working in the industry for years, and kept seeing productions on science fiction TV shows being incredibly irresponsible. In a blog post on jmsnews.com, he wrote, quote, "I'd just gotten off an SF series, Captain Power, where the budget was out of control half the time. It made me nuts. I come from this very old-fashioned school of thought that says if somebody gives you X billion dollars to make a series, it behooves you to act responsibly. Then I looked around more and found that virtually all of the series had gone and were going over budget, mainly because they weren't planned out properly. The emphasis was on just selling the idea. Who cares what happens next? Whatever one might think of the episode, the half-hour Nightcrawlers installment of the new Twilight Zone cost a tick over $1 million. That's nuts. I kept thinking, there has to be a sensible way to do a sci-fi series that's responsible, and by showing it can be done responsibly, helped create more science fiction from other people, since the industry overall is afraid of it. JMS wanted to make a grand epic story, such as Lord of the Rings or Dune. But how could you make such a story that was so epic with a reasonable budget? At the same time, he had been tinkering with the idea for a group of people trying to get along on a space station. It was while taking a shower that he realized if he combined the two ideas, he could make the epic show he wanted. Taking the cue from such classic TV shows as St. Elsewhere and Barney Miller, JMS realized that keeping the show in a central location and focusing on the consequences of political breakdowns, war, and even how small actions can lead to devastating results. He also wanted to subvert the audience's expectations. Some examples are by having a character who is a buffoon become a serious threat, or someone who is a villain become a noble hero. Another thing that JMS wanted was to have the same structure as a novel. He saw the story playing out in Babylon 5, and eventually would approach Warner Brothers. The studio had just started their own primetime entertainment network, or PTEN for short, so they needed programming, and thought that Babylon 5 would be their flagship show. However, there was some pushback on his 5-season arc proposal. In an interview for Newsarama, JMS went more into the mindset of the network that was still embracing the standard story structure at the time. Quote, "The idea back then was that when the end of the episode comes up, you hit the reset button and start the next one fresh. Maybe you might get a two-parter, but that's about it." Stations and networks felt strongly about that because they didn't think the American public had the attention span to cover more than 2 episodes. They also argued that when shows go into syndication, individual stations don't pay attention to broadcast order, so you can't rely on them to get it straight. I called a bunch of stations and said, "Do you guys ever get things out of order?" They said, "No, we always go exactly the same, off the numbers on the tapes," because they had to track that for residuals and royalties. So we know exactly what order to put them. I went back to Warner Brothers and said, "Well, you're wrong." Another concern from the network was the target audience of the show. Straczynski was proposing a show geared towards grown-ups. It had to be taken seriously, avoiding the silliness that comes with robots and kids. It would show a civilization not as a utopia, but as a flawed one. It would have greed, homelessness, addiction, bigotry, and other aspects that reflected real life. The characters would also have to grow and develop. There was also the risk of a character dying or being irrevocably altered. This was something that was very rare in science fiction. Sure, there were adult episodes of, let's say, Star Trek, but at the time, they weren't very consistent. But before I continue, I want to go over the topic everyone talks about when Babylon 5 is brought up. Did Deep Space Nine rip off Babylon 5? It's something that's been debated between Trek and Babylon fans for decades. As I stated before, JMS pitched the show to many studios with no success, and Paramount was one of them. JMS left the show Bible with Paramount when he pitched Babylon 5 to them. Then in 1991, Brandon Tartikoff approached Deep Space Nine creators Rick Berman and Michael Piller with the idea of a Star Trek show on a space station. JMS doesn't think that Berman and Piller plagiarized the show, although at one point he did consider legal action, but decided against it, since it would hurt both of their shows. Like I said in the Deep Space Nine episode, I don't think we're ever going to get a definitive answer to this question. Although it seems like everyone was friendly since both shows would play softball games together. If you're interested in going down the rabbit hole though, there are plenty of articles and videos going over the different theories. But let us move on to the pilot of Babylon 5, which was created as a TV movie called Babylon 5: The Gathering. It would prove to be a hit, and the show would be given the go-ahead. To sum up the premise of this series, Babylon 5 was about a space station called, well, Babylon 5. This station was created after a devastating war between humanity and an alien race called the Minbari. After this war, the Babylon Project would be formed to create a space station in neutral space, where aliens could come together to settle their differences. Babylons 1 through 3 were destroyed due to sabotage, and Babylon 4 mysteriously disappeared. So Babylon 5 would be commissioned as the last-ditch attempt to make the program work. The station was kind of like an outer space United Nations, and the show would feature many characters who would evolve and change throughout the 5 seasons. Allies would turn into enemies, and enemies into allies. Wars would begin that would lead to devastating repercussions for many societies. And not only that, but due to the wars, the effects it would have on the characters would change them for the rest of their lives. Now, the consistent main characters of the show were Lieutenant Commander Susan Ivanova, played by Claudia Christian, the head of security Michael Garibaldi, played by Jerry Doyle, Dr. Stephen Franklin, played by Richard Biggs, Delenn, the Minbari ambassador, played by Mira Furlan, Londo Mollari, the Centauri ambassador, played by Peter Jerusik, and Jakar, the Narn ambassador, played by Andreas Katsoulis. The starring role of the show would be taken by Commander Jeffrey Sinclair, played by Michael O'Hare, but he would leave after the first season for reasons I will get into later. The new person who took over the role of the main protagonist would be Captain John Sheridan, played by Bruce Boxleitner. Other characters on the show would include Kosh Nanarek, the Vorlon ambassador, Vir Koto, the diplomatic aide to Centauri ambassador Londo Mollari, played by Stephen Furst, Lanier, the diplomatic aide to Minbari ambassador Delenn, played by Bill Mumy, and telepath Talia Winters, played by Andrea Thompson, who would also leave after 2 seasons and end up getting replaced by Patricia Tallman, who played the new telepath Lita Alexander. Side note for you, Tallman actually was in the pilot movie, only to be replaced by Thompson in the first episode of the series. Like I said before, I had never seen the show at the time that it aired. Since I was determined to watch all 5 seasons and the TV movies, I watched all of this within a week. Jesus, the stuff that I do for you guys. But I do have to say, Season 1 episode is called back in later seasons or the TV movies as an important plot point. When you think you know where the story is headed, it suddenly shifts into a direction that you did not expect at all. While doing my research for this show, I learned of all the work JMS had to do just to keep the show from going off the rails. He said in that same Newsarama interview, quote, "We were kind of making up the rules as we went. There's a huge learning curve attached to that. The hardest part was figuring out how to layer in the key events across 5 years. What parts have to go in where. Adding to the complication, we had to balance out the actors. Some actors were hired for a full 22 episodes per season. Some were hired for 16. Some were hired for 11. Some were hired for 8. So I had this spreadsheet in my office of what episodes we could put actors into. And an actor I might need to have for a particular arc piece might not be available to be in that episode. So do I move the arc piece earlier? Or pay the extra fee to have the actor come in? Or give the arc slot to someone else? It's like this giant Lego set, but the difference is the pieces are always moving. That is insane. Not only that, but he wrote 92 episodes of the 110 that would make up the entire series. He wrote a big chunk of Season 2, all of Season 3 and Season 4, and other than one episode written by Neil Gaiman, Season 5 was all him. Do you know how mind-boggling that is? The kind of work ethic it takes to write 22 episodes a season by yourself? That is rare, if not unheard of today. However, the pilot movie, The Gathering, was a bit clunky. A lot of things would end up getting changed when the show went to series. The sets were toned down a bit to make it more bare, and not like the neon wannabe Blade Runner that we saw in the pilot. The makeup also changed when it went to series, the best example being Delenn. In the pilot, the character was supposed to be male, then evolve into a female later into the series. But it didn't work. Mira Furlan's feminine voice could not be made to sound like a male. It also looked like the character was melting. It was very off-putting. From the story side of things, Delenn had Star Wars Force powers that were omitted after the pilot movie. 2 main characters were also written off. Lieutenant Commander Laurel Takashima, played by Tamlin Tomita, and Dr. Benjamin Kyle, played by Johnny Seika. Tamlin did not want to commit to the series and thought that she could get better roles, while Seika had health issues that prevented him from staying on the show. Instead of recasting these roles, those characters got written off the show, and 2 new characters would be created. Dr. Stephen Franklin, played by Richard Biggs, and Lieutenant Commander Susan Ivanova, played by Claudia Christian. The first season was more episodic, which was intentional since JMS thought he had to ease the audience into the concept of the show. He felt that if he started the show with a long arc from the start, it would be alienating to some viewers, since it wasn't a format that many people were used to. There were a few episodes that were a bit hard to sit through in that first season. One that comes to mind is Episode 7, The War Prayer, which was pretty forgettable. But even if an episode wasn't great, such as Soul Hunter, it would still have redeeming qualities. W. Morgan Shepard would make the silly-looking character of the Soul Hunter come across as very creepy. Years later, the race of the Soul Hunters would feature heavily in the Babylon 5 TV movie, River of Souls. Sadly, there was an aspect of the show that hampered my enjoyment, and that would be the special effects. I know some people may get mad when I say this, but they were bad, guys. I'm sorry. But in my opinion, they were awful. I remember when I tried to watch this show in the 90s, and I just couldn't do it. The CGI they used was not ready for space battles. Star Trek had better effects, since they used a variety of methods for their space battles, while Babylon 5 relied solely on CGI. I understand why Babylon 5 had bad special effects. They had to be cost-effective. Feel free to disagree. But to me, it looked like a lot of the budget went to sets and prosthetics. I keep hoping one day that some fans will go back and pull a Lucas by redoing the special effects, but I know that's blasphemy to many Babylon fans. The first season was particularly great at establishing the characters and introducing concepts like the Minbari's role after the war. Both Ivanova and Talia were used to introduce the Psi Corps, an Earth Alliance organization established to help human telepaths learn how to control and use their abilities for the betterment of themselves and humanity at large. But it was practically a cult, because all telepaths had to be registered and either had to join the Corps, go to jail for life, or take medication that had the side effect of severe depression. Telepaths were hated by the general public because they were used by the government for covert ops. Plus, they also gave their services out to the private sector, businessmen, and anyone who could afford them to settle personal issues such as family disputes. Ivanova was a latent telepath who hid her ability due to her mother committing suicide because of the medication she was forced to take to disable her ability. Talia was loyal to the Corps, but during the first season, she would become disillusioned when she found out they experimented on her former lover. This season also introduced one of the most interesting and hated villains of the series, Alfred Bester, played by legendary Star Trek actor Walter Koenig. You know, I don't think I hated any character as much as Joffrey from Game of Thrones, but after watching Babylon 5, Bester is now in the lead. But unlike Joffrey, who was just a one-dimensional villain, Bester was a complex character. I don't want to spoil it, but you learn to see him in a new light later on in the first season. You still won't think he's a good guy. It's not like you're gonna stop hating him, but at least you learn his motivations for the despicable things he does. I only wish we could have seen his comeuppance during the show's run. Instead, we had to settle for the novels to finally see it happen. Amazingly, so many things got established in that first season. We learned that the Earth and Minbari war ended mysteriously, with the Minbari about to eradicate Earth when they just suddenly stopped. This all happened when the commander of Babylon 5, Jeffrey Sinclair, was captured during the war by the ruling body of the Minbari race, the Grey Council. Commander Jeffrey Sinclair was played by Michael O'Hare, a straightforward, no-nonsense military man, but who was wise and patient when dealing with the ambassadors of Babylon. He was also very compassionate, and formed deep friendships with his crew and the Minbari ambassador, Delenn. The other major development that season was about the other two races that were featured on the show, the Narn and the Centauri, who had an uneasy truce that began to shatter at the season's end, after a mysterious man offered the Centauri ambassador Londo Mollari control of a fleet of ships that destroyed a Narn outpost. Well, control is too much of a strong word for it. It was like letting a rabid dog attack somebody. And this fleet was from an ancient alien race called the Shadows. My two favorite characters on the show were the ambassadors Londo and Jakar. Londo was played by Peter Jurusik, and one of the funniest behind-the-scenes facts was how his character got his signature hair. The original concept of the Centauri hair would sort of sweep back with a slight rise to it, but when the hair props were first made, they were extra long, so they could be cut down to size. The makeup artists did not know that, so when they did the first wig test on Jurusik, they put the extra long version on him without altering it. So Peter went over to JMS to prank him. He told him how amazing this hair would be in his portrayal of Londo, and then asked him what he thought. JMS, who was afraid that Peter might be one of those touchy actors, said, "Okay." Peter then thought that JMS might be one of those touchy directors, and thought, "Oh crap." So he went along with it. For one of the most iconic accents in science fiction, Jurusik said that he wanted to create an accent that was alien, but also familiar. He decided to combine a variety of influences, including his grandmother's Slavic accent,
I really like Roombas.
a Memphis accent from a Tennessee Williams play he had just finished performing,
He gave the most terrific first reading and cool reading I've ever heard,
and a bit of an Irish brogue poetic speech rhythm.
She comes on to James here. What would possess her? Financial gain, that's what.
His goal was to reflect Londo's complex and contradictory character. The southern aspect of the accent was to give Londo a southern gentleman vibe.
I believe we decided I would be Twain.
Twin Twains? That dog won't hunt.
And also incorporated real-world accents like the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender!
And actor Peter O'Toole.
Put your fingers here, Cara, and press hard. Good. Now try it. Let your imagination explode and give it a try. Go on.
I want my people to reclaim their rightful place in the galaxy. I want to see the Centauri stretch forth their hand again and command the stars. I want a rebirth of glory, a renaissance of power.
In the first season, Londo was a buffoon. He was always drunk, gambling, and womanizing. In his opinion, the Centauri were a once powerful race that had become a shell of their former glorious selves. This was for a variety of reasons, the biggest being their arch enemies, the Narn. 100 years ago, the Centauri had enslaved the Narn and exploited their resources, which caused a bloody war that ended with the Narn overthrowing the Centauri. The Narn ambassador was Jakar, played by Andreas Katsoulis. In the first season, Jakar was power-hungry, a jerk, and a snob. He tried to get Sinclair brought up on charges, and would pamper himself with meals and other such indulgences. He had open hatred for the Centauri, and an antagonistic relationship with Londo. He was constantly taking any chance he could get to insult and irritate him. The season would end with a conspiracy to assassinate the Earth Alliance president, Luis Santiago, being uncovered by Chief of Security Michael Garibaldi. Unfortunately, Garibaldi is unable to stop it, and the man behind his death, Vice President Morgan Clark, would assume office. Garibaldi was played by Jerry Doyle, another fan-favorite character since Garibaldi was sarcastic, funny, clever, and generally kicked ass. The second season would bring some major changes to the show. The biggest one was that Michael O'Hare would be written out of the show, and a new lead would be introduced. Captain John Sheridan, played by Tron himself, Bruce Boxleitner. The reason for O'Hare leaving was very sad. During the first season, Michael O'Hare began to act erratically. Straczynski soon realized that he was suffering from mental issues and was having a psychotic break. At the end of the season, it became clear he could not continue being on the show without seeking help. He offered to put the show on hiatus while he sought treatment, but O'Hare refused, since he didn't want to put the rest of the cast and crew's jobs in jeopardy. JMS swore he would keep the secret of his condition to his grave. Michael told him, "No, until my grave." He said this because when he died, he wanted to make people aware of how mental illness could affect anyone. So Captain John Sheridan would be introduced, and this is when the show took off. Sheridan was a completely different leader. Unlike Sinclair, he was headstrong and impulsive, but he believed in his choices and was ready to take a gamble on them. This season is when things began to really ramp up. The man whom Londo made a deal with was the emissary of an ancient evil race called the Shadows, mortal enemies of the mysterious Vorlons. The mystery of why the Minbari War came to an end was revealed. Delenn also evolved into a new form of Minbari, which caused many of her people to shun her. Delenn was played by Mira Furlan, who I first saw in Lost as the crazy French woman Danielle Rousseau. She was an amazing actress and gave Delenn so much depth. She was compassionate, brave, and a natural-born leader. This season would reveal major revelations on the history of her ancestry, not just for her, but the entire Minbari race. This season would also be the beginning of the war between the Narn and the Centauri. It all began in one of the most tragic episodes in series history, The Coming of Shadows. In this episode, the Emperor of the Centauri comes to Babylon 5 to make peace with Jakar and the Narn people, but he has a heart attack, and on his deathbed he sends a message to Jakar apologizing for what the Centauri did to the Narn. The most heartbreaking part of this episode is when Jakar makes Londo have a drink with him. Jakar is ecstatic because he finally believes that a new age of friendship and forgiveness has finally come to the Narn and Centauri. However, he doesn't know that Londo has just ordered an attack on a Narn colony, effectively taking the first step toward a new Narn and Centauri war. The face of guilt and realization of what he has done is a brilliant piece of acting by Peter Jurusik. This season would ramp up the war between the Narn and Centauri, leading to one of the best episodes of the series, the Long Twilight Struggle. This episode is about the devastating defeat of the Narn and the brutal siege on the Narn homeworld. It had a particularly heartbreaking scene where Jakar is forced to request asylum on Babylon 5. This is when we saw the change in Jakar, from an egotistical bureaucrat to an inspiring hero. The speech he gave to Londo in front of the Advisory Council and League of Non-Aligned Worlds is simply iconic.
No dictator, no invader can hold an imprisoned population by force of arms forever. There is no greater power in the universe than the need for freedom. Against that power, governments and tyrants and armies cannot stand. The Centauri learned this lesson once. We will teach it to them again. Though it take 1,000 years, we will be free.
This season also turns Londo from a buffoon to an intimidating threat. But what I was most impressed by was the personal consequences that Londo would experience for his role in the war. He was alienated by everyone in the station and wished he could go back to how things were, but there was no going back. He could never be the social party jester. Even though he tried to hide it, he was full of regret. A behind-the-scenes change also occurred this season, when actress Andrea Thompson, who played Talia, left the show. Thompson was not happy with the amount of screen time on the series, so she left to join NYPD Blue. This is a real shame because her last episode, Divided Loyalties, was probably the most interesting one she was ever in. It could have taken the show in an interesting direction. In this episode, it's blatantly obvious that Ivanova and Talia had begun a romantic relationship. But due to the network being afraid of offending conservative viewers if there was a bisexual relationship, their relationship would end up being censored. Season 3 introduced and escalated some pretty interesting stories. So many things that would deserve a video of their own. A few highlights were the love story between Delenn and Sheridan, the escalation of the Shadow War, and the Orwellian McCarthyism of the New Earth Alliance. One small storyline I would like to mention is the arc about Dr. Stephen Franklin dealing with his struggles with addiction. I thought Richard Biggs did an excellent job by portraying this storyline subtly, so that when Franklin hits rock bottom, the outbursts that occur don't come out of nowhere. Biggs slowly established the groundwork for this, and not a lot of actors could do that. The other storyline featured the character of Zach Allen, who was Garibaldi's second in command. He was played by Jeff Conaway, who is the man with the most controversial line in movie musical history. Tell me more. During this season, Zach would become involved with a paramilitary organization called Night Watch. When Night Watch was first introduced, it was downplayed as a throwaway subplot, but over time it would escalate into a bit of a nail-biter of a story. The Night Watch was a clear allegory for the Nazi Gestapo, and I think Conaway did an excellent job of someone who is slowly being tempted to betray his friends. Season 4 would be the end to all of the storylines from this series. The end of the Shadow War and the war against the corrupt Earth Alliance were some of the biggest storylines in particular. One of my favorite parts of Season 4, though, is the end of the Centauri and Narn War. Londo and Jakar would become involved in a plot to overthrow the Emperor of the Centauri, Cartagia. If you like Game of Thrones, this character was sort of like a mix of Aerys II Targaryen and Joffrey Baratheon. He was a nutjob, and terrifying to boot, keeping the heads of people who opposed him in a secret room, where he would go at night to have conversations with them. Both Jakar and Londo's seasons worth of evolution all came to a head in the episode The Long Night. Jakar became the legendary hero who liberated his people, and Londo the savior to the Centauri for getting rid of Cartagia. This episode also featured the loss of innocence of Londo's assistant, Vir Koto. Throughout the series, Vir acts like Londo's conscience, warning him of what his deal with the shadow henchman Morden would end up costing him. Even though Vir was not very brave, he did the right thing when it was needed. A perfect example being when he ferried out captured Narns to safety during the war. So when Vir killed Cartagia, it was devastating, because he would never be the same again. Vir was played by Stephen Furst of Animal House fame. Furst and his portrayal always reminded me particularly of Woody Allen.
Ambassador, you were supposed to begin negotiation with the Narns over an hour ago. Commander Sinclair is quite beside himself.
One of my favorite behind-the-scenes stories was how Stephen Furst got the role of Vir.
I walked into the audition for Babylon 5. They had done the pilot, and there was about 20 guys there. They all had their hair up, you know, and I knew I was missing something. My agent didn't tell me something that I should have done. So I ran to the men's room and I started to mold my hair up in the fan, you know, with the soap. And the soap got into my eye and I started to tear and everything. And then I heard them call my name. So I went in and there was, you know, the producers there and everything, and I felt like I owed him an explanation. I got this mess of a hair, and I'm tearing, my eyes are tearing and everything, and I said, you know, I am so sorry. I didn't know about the hair thing, and then I went into the bathroom, and I got the soap, and it got in my eye, and they went, wait a second, it's Vir.
Season 4 is seen by Babylon 5 fans as rushed, and they are right to say so. At the time, the Warner Brothers PTEN was closing down, and JMS realized this would be the last season. So instead of leaving fans with a cliffhanger, he combined a lot of planned storylines that were supposed to be split into 2 seasons into one. But even though it was a bit rushed, the season had a satisfying ending, and Babylon 5 was finally complete. So everyone began to move on, when out of nowhere, TNT approached Straczynski about picking up Babylon 5 for another season. Not only that, but they also offered him TV movies and possible spin-offs. He couldn't pass up such an offer, so Babylon 5 would have its final season on TNT. Behind the scenes, though, things were not going as smoothly, as Claudia Christian wouldn't end up returning to the show. The story is a bit murky, since everyone has a different recollection of the events. Christian said that the producers and JMS did not want to work around her schedule. JMS said it was an issue of her not liking the proposed contracts. This caused a rift between Claudia and JMS that would take years to clear up. So in Season 5, Captain Elizabeth Lockley was introduced as the new person in charge of Babylon 5. Played by the beautiful Tracy Scoggins. I have always liked Scoggins ever since I saw her in one of my favorite episodes of the sitcom Wings. She is no stranger to sci-fi since she did an episode of Deep Space Nine. Lockley was a very interesting character. She was blunt but fair and had an intriguing backstory. She was the ex-wife of Sheridan, and it was revealed that she sided with the Earth Alliance instead of the Rebellion. Lockley was a soldier who followed orders, even if she disagreed with them. I only wish she would have gotten more time that season to fully delve into her character, but Season 5 had a lot of storylines to wrap up. This season would focus on Delen's assistant, Lanier, trying to find himself and move on from his unrequited love for her. Lanier was played by sci-fi legend Bill Mumy, who has been working in the science fiction genre since he was a child, two of his most famous roles being Anthony in the classic Twilight Zone episode It's a Good Life, and Will Robinson on Lost in Space. He was wise, brave, and a bit naive at times. The only real issue I had with the character was the twist that came out of nowhere at the end of the second to last episode of the series, when he abandoned Sheridan to die because he was in love with Delen. It was only for a moment before he changed his mind, but it was too late, and his shame forced him to leave. Maybe if this had been built up over a few episodes, it would have been easier to swallow, but it just felt forced. Even Mumy was unhappy with the decision. What's even more frustrating is that they never resolved it. Another storyline this season that left many fans disappointed was the telepath war. This aspect of the season revolved around a group of rogue telepaths who sought asylum from the Psi Corps on the station. As the season went on, they would be forced to declare war on the Psi Corps and their allies. Lita Alexander would become the leader of the army of telepaths, and it made sense that she would turn against Sheridan and the rest. For seasons throughout the series, she had been used and abandoned whenever she needed help. She only found herself when she met the charismatic leader of the telepaths, Byron. When he died, she snapped and dedicated herself to destroying the Psi Corps, no matter who got hurt in the process. Sadly, this arc was never finished, and we had to read the novels to get a definitive answer as to what happened. Other than those issues, I think the final season of Babylon 5 was good, but maybe I'm biased because this season had my favorite scene between Londo and G'Kar. In the episode A Tragedy of the Telepaths, Londo and G'Kar find G'Kar's former aide, Nataf, in a dungeon. Even though the war is over, she has been overlooked and never released. When G'Kar asked why she was still there, Londo says that Emperor Cartesia gave the order and just forgot to countermand the order. Londo says these things happen when he sees G'Kar's face of disbelief, telling him a story about when he started out working at the royal palace and saw a guard in the middle of the courtyard with nothing to protect. He was just standing there when he asked why, and no one knew. He said even Emperor Turhan did not know why. And after researching this, he learned that 200 years ago, as the winter came to an end, the royal princess saw the first flower growing through the snow. So she assigned a guard to watch over it to prevent anyone from stepping on the flower. After she did this, she forgot,
and thus never countermanded the order. As a result, every day for 200 years, a guard would stand in that place. Long after the flower was gone. Long after the reason had been forgotten. Long after the princess was gone. As I said, G'Kar, these things happen.
The other things that happened in Season 5 were G'Kar becoming a religious leader that would eventually force him to leave after a fanatic tried to assassinate him. Londo's fate is sealed when he has to sacrifice his free will to save his people. And finally, Sharon and Delen settle on Minbari to lead the Interstellar Alliance and raise their son. The last episode of the show, Sleeping in Light, was a tearjerker. It centered on Sheridan having one last meal with his former crew and friends. He visits Babylon 5 one last time before it's shut down and demolished. Finally, he flies to the site of the final battle of the Shadow War, Coriana 6, and he is visited by a key figure from the Shadow War, Lorien, who shepherds him to go beyond the rim. And then he disappears. It was a beautiful ending for a character that we had grown to love for 4 seasons. The TV movies would end up being aired between 1998 and 2002. Some of them were great, but some of them were terrible. As I said before, my favorite was In the Beginning. The River of Souls is another good one that guest starred Martin Sheen and Ian McShane. The others, Third Space and A Call to Arms, were either okay or just plain bad. I had to push myself to finish The Legend of the Rangers. It was a failed TV pilot which had the stupidest targeting system on a spaceship I had ever seen. There was a direct-to-DVD movie called Babylon 5: The Lost Tales, which I thought was very good, but in 1999 they released a spin-off called Crusade, lasting 13 episodes before it was cancelled. I could not get through this show, I just thought it was awful. But I do know there was a lot of network interference, so that may be a factor in how bad this spin-off was. So I guess the big question remains, should it come back? Well, unfortunately, a lot of the original cast has passed away. Richard Briggs passed away suddenly in 2004 from a tear in his aorta. Andreas Katsoulis died in 2006 from cancer. Jeff Conaway lost his fight to addiction in 2011. Jerry Doyle died from natural causes due to complications from his chronic alcoholism in 2016. Stephen Furst passed in 2017 due to issues with diabetes. And finally, the most recent, and the one that hurt the most to me, was Mia Furlan, who passed on January 20th, 2021, of issues with the West Nile virus. At the time, she was working on her autobiography, and she wrote as her final words, "I look at the stars. It's a clear night, and the Milky Way seems so near. That's where I'll be going soon. We're all star stuff." I suddenly remembered Delen's line from Joe's script. Not a bad prospect. I am not afraid. In the meantime, let me close my eyes and sense the beauty around me, and take that breath under the dark sky full of the stars. Breathe in, breathe out. That's all. For 20 years, JMS said that one executive at Warner Brothers hated Babylon 5 and prevented any movement from it returning. When that person retired, JMS suddenly got phone calls from people from Warner Brothers asking for new Babylon 5 pitches. So in 2023, an animated Babylon 5 movie called Babylon 5: The Road Home was released. This movie would take place in between Objects at Rest and Sleeping in Light, when Sheridan moved to Minbari with Delenn. He is suddenly shifted out of the time stream and winds up bouncing in time between alternate timelines and universes. I really enjoyed it and recommend it to any Babylon 5 fan. The voice actors who played the characters for the cast that were no longer with us were largely excellent. Well, except for Jakar, because I thought he sounded nothing like Andreas Katsoulis. Recently, JMS has said that there is work being done on a Babylon 5 reboot, so that should be interesting. And considering he's behind it, I can't see a world where it won't end up turning out good. So how do I feel after watching the entirety of Babylon 5? Well, other than Crusade, since I didn't finish it, I have to admit my obnoxious friend was right all along. Babylon 5 was ahead of its time. Right now you can see most of the series on the free streaming service Tubi, and the movies are on a variety of streaming services. But if you're willing to pay for all of them at once, then they are all on Prime for you to buy. So if you're interested in taking a trip to the space equivalent of the United Nations to watch aliens debate interstellar policies, then Babylon 5 is just the show for you. Just make sure that you choose better hairstyles. I'm Jesse Shade speaking on behalf of Dave and Arroyo for JoBlo.com, and thanks again for watching our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe to the JoBlo Originals channel. Tell all your friends who like this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all our latest videos. We are an independent company that appreciates all of your support, and we'll see you next time for the next episode of Gone, But Not Forgotten.